Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and I wonder whether you think that a computer hacker could break into the US or the Russian nuclear weapons arsenal and launch a nuclear war? Well, I don't want to find out the true definitive answer to that because the only way to find out would be if it happens. But there are people who are very concerned about that, including Bruce Blair, who apparently published an article in the New York Times a while back saying, well, we can't exclude that possibility. Well, okay, that's something we need to think about then. So we have a conversation lined up today. In Britain, we have Andrew Futter, who is a professor at the University of Leicester, political science, I guess, and I hope, and the author of a book that came out about a year ago called Hacking the Bomb. And that seems one of the main concerns in his book is how safe are we as far as the maintenance of nuclear weapons from that kind of potential for catastrophe. And closer to home in Kingston, at his webcam, we have Hans-Christian Breede, who is a professor of political science or international relations at both the Royal Military College and at Queen's University. And this is one of his concerns too. So I'm going to ask you both to say hello. Andrew, say hi.
Hello everybody that's listening. I hope you enjoy the next 50 or 60 minutes or so.
And Christian, hello.
Hi, how are you guys doing? This is quite a kick. I've only done these a few times, so this will be an interesting experience.
So Andrew, I'll tell you what, why don't you launch us into this conversation by giving us kind of your own précis or your own, maybe since you've published it a year ago, you may have second thoughts, additional or qualifying remarks to make about the opinions that you expressed in that book. Tell us, how worried should we be about having a hacker launch a nuclear war?
Thank you very much. I think the best way to start this is to go back 5 or 6 years ago when I was putting together the proposal for the project from which the book came. And at this time, everything seemed to be vulnerable. It was cyber this, worries about everything could be vulnerable. But no one had really thought about nuclear weapons. No one had looked at these two things, this possible worst case scenario. And it just seemed that this whole idea that many of your viewers will have seen the film War Games from 1983, which was this futuristic sci-fi film. Well, 30 odd years later, could this actually come true? So I spent a bit of time looking at this and trying to see.
I never saw that film. Is that the thesis of the film, that somebody does that in the movie?
Well, I don't want to give the plot away to people who haven't watched it. It does star a very young Matthew Broderick, and I think many of the themes that we're going to touch on today actually come out in that film quite well. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is this was something written a generation ago, but is really, really germane in terms of a lot of the themes that it raises. You know, could somebody hack into things? Could somebody cause a launch? Could somebody do something through networks, through the internet, through computers, etc., that cause nuclear war? So what I said about trying to do in this book was, yes, answer the question about how vulnerable things might be, but also provide a framework of how we can understand this. So it seems, if you ask somebody either, no, clearly nuclear weapons were completely safe because, you know, they don't run on the internet, or a submarine is under the ocean, or etc., or if you ask somebody else, everything is vulnerable because we live in this world where everything is interconnected. So it was a chance to sort of try and unpack this and begin thinking about the problem, begin putting it into manageable chunks and trying to outline the questions that we should be asking. Unfortunately, a lot of the really interesting things people wouldn't tell me. So this book does not give you a 101 about how you would hack into a nuclear weapon, which is probably understandable and probably also a good thing.
Unfortunately, they wouldn't, but fortunately, they wouldn't.
Well,
yeah. They don't go around telling everybody everything they know.
But what I got from speaking to, and I was lucky to travel all over the world, so not just speaking to people in the UK, the US, but also South Asia, Russia, and China, and further afield too, is that there's a real growing concern that these systems could be vulnerable in some ways. It wouldn't be easy to get in. It certainly wouldn't be easy to cause a launch or an explosion, and it's probably very, very unlikely. But it's very dangerous to assume that they're invulnerable, because they're not. But I think it's worth just ever so slightly unpacking this. The way we need to think about this threat is not a homogeneous thing. So cyber in itself, or a cyber attack in itself, covers such a wide variety of things, all of which are quite different, and only a tiny amount might actually be a problem for us here. We also need to unpack what different actors would try and do. So to me, it doesn't seem like a state actor who's likely to be most capable would want to cause a launch or an explosion. A non-state actor might, but I believe a non-state actor would be less capable in this realm. We need to think also about this challenge of the difference between actually hacking into a command and control system, maybe the targeting plans, maybe sending false go codes, etc., and then a sort of a different step of messing with early warning and messing with signaling, to a third step, and this may be closer to some of the work that Christian's done, about messing with the information environment, which leads to escalation, miscalculation, and exacerbating crises. So what I try and do in the book is pull all of this, pull this sort of apart to think about different pathways, different problems, and try and focus people on the actual questions that I think, or that we need to answer, and the way we need to look at this. And one of the, or at least the kind of the final point that I make, is that whilst it wouldn't be easy to hack into these weapons, they are not invulnerable, and I am worried that we might be moving in a direction which makes them more vulnerable. If you make things more complex, you incorporate more complex coding, more functionality, all of these things, if you commingle it with other weapons systems rather than keeping nuclear separate, all of this, I think, increases the chances of things going wrong, or of problems in the future.
Okay. All of this is you're focusing on the notion that somebody intentionally does this on, they intend to launch something, right? It's not, you're not focusing on the potential for accidents.
Well, both I would say. So there's a whole body of work on normal accidents theory, and what I've tried to do is take some of that and think about how that applies in this realm. So the more complex, the more commingled systems that we develop, the more different nodes there are, the more access points, the more functionality, the chances of things just going wrong increase. So one of the examples I use in the book is that at NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, in the late 1970s, early 1980s, experienced a lot of problems. So there was a faulty tape loaded, which simulated an attack. There was a circuit chip which caught fire, all sorts of things which caused problems. It was fairly easy to diagnose that and figure out, even in the context of the Cold War. My worry is today, with all of these things now digitized on computers, with us further away from understanding how it works, is would we be able to diagnose problems in the same way in a more complex computerized environment like that? So the risk of accidents and problems inherent within this are there, but this also interacts with those that might want to do harm and attack as well.
Well, we hear that the only two people in the world who can deliberately launch a nuclear war would be Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. That they have the final, and that it's all set up such that without their pushing the right codes or entering whatever they have to do, the button, that nothing would happen. And are you saying we wish that were true, but it's not?
It's very difficult to say. I suspect, given the differences between countries firing change and authority to use nuclear weapons, that it is possible that this could be circumvented. But there's two ways. So first of all, somebody could deliberately get in there and cause something to happen. There is also duping a president or a leader into making decisions based on false information. So again, the idea of knocking out early warning systems or doing other things. So there's an indirect and direct pathway. Do I think it's likely that somebody can do this? No. Is it possible? Probably. But again, it goes back to the importance of thinking about who would want to do this, what capabilities they have. And to me, it doesn't seem this would be a nation state. It would be a terrorist group. The argument I often make is that a terrorist group have probably got easier ways to cause mass casualties or mass terror than to do this. So yes, it's an issue. Yes, it's perhaps a growing issue, but it's part of a broader package of how we think about this.
Last night I just happened to have been reading an article about that Malaysian airliner that went, and it was evidently quite clear that it was done by the pilot, and clearly a very well executed plan. Now, you have to wonder, of course, how anybody could be so malevolent. But, if there's somebody like that who's malevolent enough to want to take down an entire airplane with him, there's probably somebody else in the world who is also smart and who might also like to take down the whole world with him. And I don't even know how to have a conversation about that. What do we do with the reality that there are people who have such potential?
Well, I think this drives to the heart of the cyber problem, if you like, which is that it's very much a human problem. Humans are absolutely central in this. We focus on sophisticated, high-tech systems, but actually this is a very human thing. Humans develop coding, humans think about software for particular purposes, they use this, they base their decisions on it. So I think humans are a key part of this. And going back to your example, one of the key areas that needs focus on here is personnel reliability programs. So we saw a few years ago, didn't we, that there was potential cheating in US Air Force tests. Mm-hmm. There was the example of the B-52, I think it was, that flew across America with weapons armed. There was the example of the 5 or 6 zeros that we used in the permissive action. There's a whole host of different things. So it's about focusing on people, a lot of this. And this is where I think the two things come together. The nuclear mission, the nuclear enterprise has to be about people, getting people to act in certain ways, making sure and understanding the importance of security, cyber hygiene, etc. And this, I think, feeds into the broader, if you like, cyber challenge. So one of the big things one of the things I argue in the book is that while some of the vectors and tools are new when we talk about cyber, a lot of the vulnerabilities and dynamics have always been there. So nuclear weapons have always been vulnerable to to people, inadvertent launches, or a rogue commander, the Dr. Strangelove scenario, this sort of thing. So what I think the cyber challenge is doing is just drawing our attention back to a lot of these fundamental problems and dynamics within the nuclear mission that maybe we haven't focused on as much for a generation or so.
Yeah, we clearly haven't focused on it enough. And in fact, as somebody who spends a lot of time working as an anti-nuclear weapons activist, I'd be the first to say it's really hard to get people to listen to you about it, unfortunately. People do not want that conversation. Now, you may know the story about Bruce Blair and his discovery, because this is something I heard about a year or so ago, and I may have all this wrong. But it was something like this. Bruce Blair was a missileer working in one of these underground, things with the big ICBMs, as I recall. And after he finished that, I believe it was afterwards, he figured out how, if he had another partner, he would need 2 people to do it. But if he had a partner who was also in cahoots with him, they could together launch one of those suckers. And he tried, I may be wrong about my recollection because I haven't reviewed it, but I believe he tried to report this as a threat to somebody in authority and was told, shut up and go away. You mustn't trouble us with all this stupid information that we don't want to hear. Am I wrong? Can you, or maybe, Christian, something about that story that I've forgotten, either one of you?
I'm not familiar with the details per se, but I do know, and sort of this is to Andrew's point, this is fundamentally a human problem for sure. Whether it's 1 person, 2 people, 5 people, it takes individuals at various levels to agree to the decision to launch a weapon system, whether it's nuclear, conventional, what have you. So the spirit of the discussion, I think, is very true. Whether the details are accurate, and I couldn't say, but certainly from my experience and what I've looked at in this problem, it is, it's funny. I tell my students all the time, it's not that Donald Trump has his finger on a button. It's very much an analogy, an imagery. that doesn't reflect reality. It's certainly the president's call, the chief executive's call, and whether or not to deploy the weapon, but it still has to be executed at all the levels of the chain of command between that person that's making the decision and the person that's actually like turning the keys or pressing the actual button on the system itself. So there's lots of room for miscommunication, spoofing, error, and whatnot. And I think the story you're recounting and this whole discussion kind of got me thinking of something really interesting, which is this idea of this trade-off in security. And it's something that we find at all levels, whether it's emerging technology or cyber or anything. And it's age old, this discussion between efficiency and resilience. And you know, as soon as you start overlaying security measures that start to account for you know, rogue actors or things like that, it reduces the efficiency and, in fact, some cases, the resilience of that system functioning when it's needed to function. And so if you make it hard to use something, that's good. If you make it too hard, now we have a problem, because now the deterrence is lost. Because one of the things about effective deterrence is that the credibility is there that this will actually be used if something happens. That's how a deterrent relationship works. If I'm confident that you have something, but you're never going to use it, or you're incapable of using it, or your command and control systems are so messed up and inefficient that it will never happen, then I'm not deterred. However, if it's the opposite, then I'm going to think twice before I issue my orders. And so it's really, it's a fundamental trade-off that's very problematic, which, you know, that response of, you know, shush, don't say anything, in many ways that rings kind of true. And I could see that happening, and that's plausible, because you want to make sure that it's still not too easy, but reasonably easy, that, you know, under pressure, when seconds literally count, that those systems are launched before they're destroyed.
You want to, I mean, speak for yourself, fella. You're saying you want to make sure. I don't want to make sure of that. Matter of fact, I mean, as a mother, I am very familiar with the practice of deterrence, because I have a son who's now nearly in his late 50s, but there were plenty of times when he was about 4 years old when I tried to deter him by threatening various things that I would do if he didn't comply with my wishes.
Right.
And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. And I can't give you a very good explanation for why it would and why it wouldn't. But all I know is I wouldn't bet the future of humankind on the reliability of any deterrence system. Thank you very much. So you can keep your plan to deter the Russians or whomever, or the North Korean leader, or whomever you would like to deter. But I would just as soon get rid of the damn things altogether, if you don't mind.
Well, that would be ideal, for sure. And let me clarify one thing about deterrence and your analogy of trying to deter your 4-year-old versus trying to deter your 50-year-old, I think, is fantastic. Deterrence to work is based on an enormous assumption. And I think you know what it is. It's that the person you're deterring is, we used to say rational, but that's not entirely accurate. It's that they have the same values that you have, that they value the same thing you do. And a 4-year-old, frankly, probably doesn't value the same things you do. They don't value the fact of staying quiet when it's time for bed, or going to bed and getting a good night's sleep, or whatever the situation was where your deterrence failed. But we really hope, and again, this is a huge assumption, and this is where deterrence works, is when the competitors in the environment are both, you know, thinking rationally, for lack of a better term. Here's the issue that I find really fascinating, kind of to circle it back to a little bit of what I look at in terms of how do we deal with, you know, what's the policy framework that we need to apply for emerging technology, in particular artificial intelligence? Because a lot of people are going back to the idea of arms racing as an analogy, and deterrence as an analogy for dealing with artificial intelligence, which I think is really problematic. And we look back at the Cold War and see, wow, well, it worked in the Cold War, so why can't it work now? There's similar issues of not just misuse and accident in terms of the risks, but these more fundamental structural risks. Again, it goes back to Andrew's point about the human connection, and the human piece of this is we deter human actors, our competitors, from employing systems in ways that might be counter to what we want to see. And this is the issue, is that is one of the frameworks that's being put forth. I'm not suggesting that certainly not advocating for it. I think we need something else for some of the reasons you identified as well. You know, we can't deter machines in that way, but this is where this is why I'm so interested in this field, is that the policy gap is immense. We have these absolutely hugely capable technologies that are rapidly being developed, and those developments and capabilities are vastly outstripping our ability to understand how to employ them in a responsible way. And so people are grasping at straws. And so, like, I bring up the deterrence because that's where some folks have leaned towards. How can we use emerging technology, and particularly artificial intelligence, in a responsible way? And the answer is, well, let's look at how we deterred nuclear weapons as an example. And I agree with you. I think that's wholly unsatisfying. But that's where we're at. That's where the state of the policy debate is, and it's terrifying.
Well, okay, Andrew, I'm encroaching on your territory. This is where you should step in and join the debate.
Okay, so just to go back to something you mentioned and bring this back to the point you made about Bruce Blair. So I don't know either if you could do what he said you could do. He's a pretty respected thinker on these issues. He was there, he did it. So I think there's, you know, he was at the coalface, as it were. So I think there's a good reason to believe that some of what he says has probably got a lot of credibility. One of the big problems here, and it's exacerbated in the current environment, the current sort of, if you like, new technology environment that we're living through, is that nuclear strategy is kind of based on this thing called an always never dilemma. So you always want, for deterrence to work, this is the thinking or the theory, you always have to have a credibly threaten use of nuclear weapons, that you can use it, that you will do it, and that your systems will work. That's the always side. But at the same time, you want the never side as well, which is you never want an accident, you never want to use them without proper authorization, etc., etc. And of course, as Christian said, this is a balance. Whatever you do to improve one, you often weaken the other. One of the problems that we had particularly, and continue to have to some extent with US and Russian nuclear arsenals, is a tendency towards the always side over the never. It's not quite the same with other nuclear weapon states, but for historical reasons, etc., etc., with the US and Russia, it still remains the case. That means that these weapons will never be as safe as they can be. That's certainly true historically, but it also means today that actually there's inbuilt problems that could be exacerbated because of a reliance on wanting to use weapons quickly and because of credibility, exactly as Christian said. And one of the interesting links that you could have with artificial intelligence and with how the way we handle or the way we manage and think about nuclear order is changing is that one of the other things Bruce Blair talks about is this thing called the dead hand system, which the Soviet Union may or may not have developed, or perimeter, I think is the proper name for it. The idea that they've developed a kind of a semi-autonomous response system. So there's a possibility when you start.
Explain that, because I have another book on my iPad that I once looked at called The Dead Hand, and it was about a program some years ago that was supposed to be developing a system which was sort of like the story in Dr. Strangelove, if I'm not mistaken, that no matter what you do, you can't undo it. Could you explain that? I'm not sure I understand enough to.
So I think Stanley Kubrick all those years ago probably put it as well as anybody ever could. But it's this idea that, if you like, and it's linked in with the whole irony of calling it mad and everything else. But the idea is that to deter, you always have to make sure you retaliate, to make sure you're always credible. You're on the always side of the always never thing. But of course, if you go so far, and the point of Dr. Strangelove is if you keep it secret, it doesn't deter anyone. Therefore, it causes, et cetera, et cetera. But it just shows how the logic of always wanting to be able to use nuclear weapons to, in theory, underpin deterrence leads you down these very dangerous pathways to thinking, well, how do we make things quicker? Which bits do we automate? How do we take humans out of the loop? How do we constantly assure this? And it goes back to the human issue. So one of the things that happened certainly during the Cold War and probably happens now is that the US, and I guess others as well, will run lots of drills. So there'll be a test to see whether the operators would act as they should act if there was an actual attack and if weapons were to be used. And I think, I don't have the numbers at hand, but I think they found a lot of operators don't do it. So there's always been a push to allow technology to do the bits that the humans do to assure something will work. But I'm sure, as Christian will say, that this is a real complicated and problematic way that we may well be moving towards for not just nuclear, but for other systems as well.
Well, we know of two cases where Russians saved the world by refusing to obey their orders. One was that nuclear submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the other one was during the early Archer, or what was it called?
Able Archer. Yeah.
Able Archer exercises, I think. When Stanislav Petrov, was that his name, refused to obey orders. A beautiful case. So we know, thank God, that we've had two Russians who saved civilization. Is there a case of an American who has ever been in a position to make such a fateful decision, and who, I would love to say, an American who saved the world?
Not that I know of to the same extent. There have been a lot of false alarms at NORAD. So the possibility that the Soviets may have maybe conducting a surprise first strike has always been in the minds of policymakers, rightly or wrongly. So whenever false alarms came along, whether it be early warning systems mistaking stars or a whole host of other things that have gone wrong, it's always relied on humans ultimately to think, well, hang on, can we place it? Does this make sense? Can we place it in context? So not as acutely as somebody like Petrov, but a lot of the people at NORAD or within the chain of command probably have had to make decisions to saying, look, no, this doesn't make sense. Let's wait. And actually by waiting, they managed to figure out that it's a false alarm or something's gone wrong. So
I think actually William Perry was in that position once. I believe when he was Secretary of Defense, and he was for many years in various administrations, I think, that he got a situation where there was a tape put in by mistake or something of that kind. It was a false alarm. And I don't think he's ever claimed to have saved the world, but at any rate, the question was, do you wake up the president or do you whatever? And I don't know what the outcome of it was. But the fact that things like this can happen, and we have to assume that they've happened more often than we've been told. I mean, why would they go telling people that they've screwed up? And Christian, let's go back to you. Why is it that these instances that we've been discussing of terrifying situations that could have meant the end of civilization, why would you still then continue to believe that what we ought to do is have a system of nuclear deterrence?
Well, it's not, again, it's looking at deterrence, it's I don't want to be a deterrence apologist, but I will say that this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And this is the challenge I think the Obama administration had with going to nuclear zero, which was, it's all well and good that you do it, but you have, your competitor has to sort of agree to it as well. And in a world where a competitor has a huge capability advantage that something like those nuclear weapons provide, if you erode your deterrence, that's a huge strategic risk that you're taking, that it's hard to build the trust. And so there's been some interesting research done on confidence building games and trust building that was done towards the end of the Cold War, in trying to reduce the stockpiles, which is certainly in the right direction. But it's, unless everyone agrees to get rid of them, it's really challenging to have, it's that classic standoff argument. You know, we everybody put your guns down at the same time and we'll be safe, trusting that everybody puts their guns down and no one's got a second one in their boot somewhere. And that's the key issue here is how do we verify on top of it? And nuclear weapons are an interesting analogy too for some of the work on emerging technologies. Again, it's this dual use piece. I guess the really unsatisfying answer is I haven't got a clue. What I do know is that the deterrence regime that we had during the Cold War, as unstable and fraught as it was, we got, like I said before, we got lucky. And I think if we take anything away from our experience in the last 70 years is that, you know, we got lucky. And let's not say that deterrence is the way forward and that deterrence is the only way forward. Let's be a bit more creative. Let's try to be a bit more innovative and brave and thinking, what else can we do? How else can we manage this? Yes, deterrence worked in the Cold War, but you know, and this is what we're getting point. This is the point we're getting at. Like I said before, we got very, very lucky. There are so many mistakes. And this is why I thought of deterrence when I was thinking of, you know, what is the foundation for policy for emerging technology, is a lot of the same problems persist with emerging technology. There's huge dual use issues. There's lots of benefits from AI, lots of benefits from social media, from the internet of things and things like that. but there's a pernicious dual use side to it. There's a dark side to it. There's a way that this can in fact be weaponized, not to put too fine a point on. So how do we deal with that? You know, like in your experience with Facebook, how do we ensure that hate speech isn't on Facebook, but what you're doing is, right? How do we do that? And that's not easy. And again, I don't think deterrence is the answer. And so, you know, we think about misuse, we think about accident risks. Those are all there with nuclear weapons as well. And this is one of the things I wanted to just raise so that you know, I think we're all aware of this. But you've got a show on tech, a very sort of technology heavy show with two political scientists. And the reason why I think this works is that we're not talking about the technical issues. We're not talking about the errors in coding. We're not talking about those sorts of things. We're talking about the structural risk. And that's where political scientists have a role to play.
But earlier on, we talked about it as being really a human problem. And I have to see that as similar to the kind of conversation every time there's a mass school shooting in the U.S. The answer comes back, well, it's really the people. We have to fix the people. If we have to do more in terms of mental health, or trying to, you know, because the problem is not the guns, but the people. Well, it's the guns with the people. And of all the things that one could attempt to do in this world, I think the hardest is to try to fix the people. You know, trying to intervene in such a way as to catch all the crazy people before they go really crazy and do what they might want to do. And I don't think it's possible, and I don't even want to try. I think that's a misguided approach, because we're never going to be able to anticipate all of the loonies before they take action. And the case of this guy with the Malaysian airliner is a case in point, because all the records of his behavior show him to have been an exemplary human being. Apparently he wasn't so exemplary in private life, but nevertheless, you wouldn't know that. And thank goodness we don't know everything dirty about each other. So, Andrew, I've taken the floor, and it's really your floor. Go back to it.
So there might be a way of kind of connecting this a little bit. So with what Christian was saying about deterrence and what you were saying about you know, the role of people. So one of the things that's becoming more and more obvious in the nuclear realm, but particularly when it interacts with emerging technologies, is that we need to build in more time for decision making, more time to use nuclear weapons. And what a lot of these technologies in the context are doing is compressing that. Cyber, you know, you can be anywhere in the world in milliseconds in cyber, right? And it's not the 30 minutes it takes for an ICBM. So things are moving in that direction. So it's thinking about time. And when it comes to deterrence, yeah, I mean, there are obviously very different views on this in terms of whether it works, whether we've been lucky, et cetera, et cetera. It's right at the heart of political science. But one of the ways we could look at this is about risk management. So if you accept that it's going to be unlikely we get rid of the idea of deterrence quickly, which is probably true, rightly or wrongly, then it's about how do we make that system safer. And so one of the things that people have called for in this realm is to de-alert weapons. So instead of being able to use a Minuteman missile or some other system within minutes, to make it longer. You could take the warhead off the missile. You could do a whole host of all sorts of things to put more time in. So one of the big concerns I have in the, if you like, the cyber context is that things happen too quickly. You don't have time. So a good example here being the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place over a number of days. If that sort of crisis happened today, it just wouldn't happen over days. It would happen quickly. It would have real-time media. It would have all of this. So the more things we can do to build in time and change postures within deterrence, maybe as a means to moving deterrence in the future, I think that's where we need to focus at the moment within this realm. And there's a second issue that kind of links to this, and it's something that this book and my next bit of work is thinking about as well. Is it possible to envisage a future where nuclear weapons are certainly augmented, but even overtaken by other technologies? Now, AI is a bad example here because AI is not really a weapon in a sense. It's something quite different. But you could see the whole sort of cyber-enabled or AI-enabled non-nuclear weapon systems with more precision, perhaps more yield, a whole host of other things, beginning to change the calculus of how you deter. So it may be that instead of relying purely on punishment with nuclear weapons, you have a more diversified deterrent strategy that involves preemptive strikes, perhaps, that involves more deterrence by denial, missile defenses, a whole host of other things. So I think we're seeing two things at play. There's a shift in how we think about deterrence, which is being driven by technology, if you like, the supply side, and at the same time, a need to go back to those central thinking about nuclear weapons, often developed in the 1960s, and update it and think about how we make that safer today. And I think this is it's a much more blurred context. In the past, we always looked at nuclear weapons and some of the things that Christian's been talking about separately. Today, I think they've become so much more intermingled, and we have to think about the interconnections between them.
Whoa, wait, just about 30 seconds ago, you freaked me out when you talked about we should start thinking about preemptive strikes.
So it's not preemptive strikes, but ever since the Bush in the US, the Bush administration's nuclear posture review in 2002, there's been a move to diversify the way that threats, and particularly nuclear threats, are deterred. Now, the most obvious manifestation is ballistic missile defense, but this is also increasingly, I think, being augmented by other ways of preventing attackers, in this case always the rogue state idea, from being able to use nuclear weapons against them. And this is, I think a few years ago, it was leaked out of the Pentagon, this was increasingly includes cyber attacks. So it wouldn't be called preemption as such, but it sort of rolls into this global strike deterrence idea. But it is a shift, I think, in the way the US and potentially others in the future seek to deter threats.
Well, yeah, but that really is, to me, the most terrifying thing of all. I mean, deterrence is bad enough, but the idea that maybe we should be able to actually use some of these little toys of ours, especially these tactical weapons. Maybe they haven't even tried to get rid of those. Maybe we can use them a battlefield weapon, a small one, just to like a shot over the bow, to warn them that we might get serious next time. In other words, you're eroding the whole notion that nuclear weapons are entirely for deterrence. They are never to be used. They're only to be used to threaten people, but you don't really ever intend to really, really use them. When you start saying, well, yeah, we might sometimes use them. In fact, why don't we plan how to use them a little bit now and then? Whoa.
Well, that's
Andrew, you just give my hair standing on end.
But it's worth unpacking this. So what I'm saying is it's non-nuclear weaponry that is going to be used in this thing, because it just opens up new possibilities. So I think nuclear weapons always be for deterrence. Even, again, whether you agree with it or not, the Trump administration's plan for new lower yield nuclear weapons, it's all part of a deterrent framework. It's aimed at how you would combat China and Russia in a future scenario. And so I think that is slightly. My point is just that the technological shift is creating different types of capabilities that could be used that are not nuclear. And that is changing the equation. It always used to be missile defense, but increasingly it's a whole range of other technologies which we saw on the battlefield 30 years ago, the revolution in military affairs, the first Gulf War, all of that stuff, is now, I think, impinging on the nuclear realm as well and changing the way we see stuff. So it's not necessarily that nuclear weapons are more usable, although there is a debate about that, as you know, in the United States.
I think Trump thinks they are usable. Why would you have them if you don't intend to be able to use them?
So the underlying argument, of course, is, and this goes back to what Christian was saying, is if you don't plan to use them, then it undermines the credibility of deterrence. So you have to show that you're able to do it, or at least this is the theory. So if you, to be able to deter, you have to convince somebody else that you are genuine, that you'll be able to use it. Well, this means you probably need to have plans of how you would use these weapons, perhaps not as far as they went in the Cold War, but it's the logic that comes within the deterrence framework.
Metta, if I may for a second, this again goes right back to the idea of policy, and you brought Andrew, the analogy of Dr. Strangelove and how it's not deterrence if nobody knows about it. It's a signaling piece, right? And policy is a mechanism through which we signal. So if we just put on paper, quite literally, here's how we're going to use these things, should that never scenario actually materialize, that has a deterrent effect all on its own, as terrifying as that may be, but that's that deterrent effect. But Andrew, I got a question for you. This sounds very familiar, this discussion of, can we use these? Can we fight with nuclear weapons? And this brings to mind the idea of the debate in the 70s with limited nuclear options and the escalation ladder. Do you feel that our ability to control the escalation has improved, or are we in that same problem?
I don't think that the barriers to nuclear use is changing necessarily. I just think there's a whole set of new technologies that are changing the picture that may be used in other ways to do this. I'm really worried about escalation ladders.
Yeah.
And I actually think we need to go back and try and reassess what we think we know about it. So we had a certain idea of how escalation might work in Cold War Europe, right? And it won't look like that today, because you've got different capabilities, you'll have a different information space, and that changes lots of stuff, including signaling, a whole host of things. So I'm really worried that we kind of bungle towards something that we really don't understand, and we think will play out in a certain way because we have an idea of how it should have done in the past, and be very different. Not least if you start including cyber attacks, anti-space capabilities, a whole host of other things. The escalation ladders, not just US Russia, but US China, India, Pakistan, look very, very different, I think, and we need to understand that.
That's a good point. We just wrapped up a conference here in Kingston earlier this week, or last week, I guess. The Kingston Conference on International Security was our 14th annual. So I just did a little shameless plug there. Hopefully that's okay. But we talked about this idea of the changing world order, and what are the things that are causing to change? How is it changing? What does that shift look like? And one of the big things that came out of this conference was that, the bipolarity is gone, which we all kind of knew, but it's being replaced by almost a genuine multipolarity, to the point where we're dealing with multiple peer competitors. And that's new in terms of this time and period where we've had this kind of technology, this kind of capability. In the past, where we've had genuine peer competitors, it was all swords and horseback. And again, like I say to my students all the time when we talk about, the impact of technology, it was really, this is kind of crass, but it was hard to kill people back then. Like, it took a lot of effort. And nowadays, and this is where we're talking about this, why this is so problematic, is the human effort is much less now to create much greater devastation. And this is where I get nervous. And I'm we need to think creatively about this and not rely on those past models, because as you pointed out, that was then, and this is now, and it's a whole new world. And that became very clear in the conferences last week that we were at.
Was there anybody in your conference who said, well, look, how about just questioning this whole damn deterrence assumption that we have to go through maintaining deterrence? I mean, everything is held in place by that. And if you really say it's not worth it, the risks are too great, and no matter how we do it, deterrence, it becomes more and more dangerous. And we'd be safer taking our risks by I'm thinking back to the time when I think Kennedy and Khrushchev had a kind of a mutual backing off. I'll back off 3 feet. I think of myself as in a cowboy movie where the two guys are in high noon in the streets, and they both want to back out of this, let's say, but they can't, because they don't dare run, they'll get shot. So and you want the sheriff to come around the corner and say, okay guys, I got you both covered, drop your guns. That would be great, but there ain't no sheriff. So what we have to do is figure out, one of them say, all right, I'm going to walk back 2 steps, and let's see if you match me, and you move back 2 steps. Now I'm going to move my gun down 3 inches. Let's see if you move yours, etc. So they were doing that until I think Kennedy got killed and Khrushchev got ousted, and who knows, it might have been working if they had backed out of a deterrent situation just a little bit through. It's a reverse arms race where you had the arms race of I'm matching your aggressive move by upping you a little bit. Instead, it's I'm matching your disarmament move by backing away a little bit.
Yeah, this is the trust building and confidence building regimes that we were talking about earlier that were done all through the Cold War, whether it's the strategic arms limitation talks. And again, this is not going to help at all with making you feel any better, but a lot of those what is it, the NPT has, or not NPT, there was a regime that just was both the US and Russia just pulled out of, that was
INF,
that. INF, that's it, right? Thank you. So we're we were there. We were on the right track, and now we've backed away from it. But in terms of that, to answer your question about deterrence coming up in the conference, it came up a few times, but one of the points that I thought was really interesting was that this idea of a version 2.0 of the Cold War, whether it's between the US and Russia or whether it's between the US and China, is not what's in the offing. What we're seeing instead is a subtle supplantation, if that's the right word, but sort of replacement of the existing order, based on the World Bank, IMF, and things like that, with new ones that are actually competing and challenging it, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or the Asia International Infrastructure Bank. They're very subtly replacing what's there. And so what we're looking at now, instead of deterrence, we're looking at how do we, and this is actually kind of optimistic, how do we coexist? How do we manage these different ideas of how to organize things? And do so in a way that doesn't result in conflict. Because one of the things that did come out very clear is none of these actors, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's the US, want this to turn into a war.
People say Bolton is very keen to have a war with Iran. I don't know. Anyway, that's sort of a side issue.
Yeah. No, fair enough. But there are, I'd like to still think there's adults left in the room that at all levels.
Okay, Andrew, I hear you being almost as worried as I am. I think you're more worried than Christian is. I think Christian is starting from the position of this is the way things really are, and we have to work with the way things really are. I think in terms of this is the way things really are, and God damn it, we've got to get out of this very quickly. Do something. Where are you, Andrew, on this?
Probably somewhere in the middle. I worry that the arms control and if you like disarmament momentum that we had for 50 years has basically run out of steam. So the end of the INF signifies, I think, the end of a period, a really significant period. The politics have changed, but I think there are a lot of people, a lot of sensible people that do want to manage risks, and I think that's where we need to come back to. So we've had the nuclear ban treaty a couple of years ago. That's a very strong statement. It'll be interesting to see how that links in with the next nuclear non-proliferation review conference next year. But I think where we are now is more of a management strategy. It's about trying to find ways to minimize risk. And just to go back to one of the points that you mentioned earlier, of course, the classic argument that is always made is that if you don't have nuclear deterrence, if you get rid of nuclear weapons, this creates a more level playing field or a greater likelihood for conventional war. Again, this is very much debated, but it's the whole long peace idea and that sort of thing. But where I'm coming to this, I think there's been a feeling over the last few years that we're an end of arms control because of INF, because of problems in the US-Russia relationship, a whole host of other things. But I don't think we should despair too much. I think what it needs is people with new energy that look at this problem in different ways. And it goes back to something that Christian was saying, is we shouldn't necessarily think that managing the future will look like how we manage the past. So we have a certain set of models and ideas of how we manage nuclear weapons, probably with a fair bit of luck as well. But it doesn't mean that that's what things look like in the future. So the kind of the incumbent thing upon all of us at the moment is to try and think about, well, what are the ways that we do this? How do we rebuild people-to-people relations? How do we think about this as a truly human problem? And one of the things that always strikes me is at the moment is that interaction between people has kind of gone. I mean, even during the Cold War, Russian and US leaders, scientists, statesmen sat down and talked. Even if they couldn't agree on anything else, they realized it was important to talk about this stuff. That seems to have gone. So I think a return to that is absolutely fundamental. And the other thing, and I fully agree with Christian, is this is now a global problem. And this needs everybody to sit down and think about how we manage and mitigate risks. So it's about thinking outside of the box, and it's about creating perhaps new frameworks to think about. It's not just accepting that arms control is dead, nuclear weapons will always be there, we're moving inexorably towards a more dangerous environment, but to act and get people together and think, well, what can we agree on? We won't agree on everything, but how can we move this forward and make ourselves safe?
100% agree.
Do you? Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I think maybe we can all agree that it's a good thing to have conversations. And I'm dismayed by you're right, Andrew, that the amount of contact is less than it used to be. I remember during the Cold War, I was often the guest of the Soviet Peace Committee, oddly, because I was, not exactly a very a strong supporter of Russian policies. But at any rate, they actually often invited me to conferences in Russia and in Europe too. And recently I had a reason to try to help. A friend of mine is organizing a march, a Gandhian type march across Asia. And we wanted to have her go into Sochi and have a conference there in the edge of Russia. And I spent about 2 weeks calling old friends in Russia saying, can you tell me whom to get in touch with to try to set up just a discussion, just a meeting of people who are, old-fashioned peace activists, Gandhians. They may be wearing white robes or something, I don't know. But at any rate, they're certainly not nuclear strategists, but people who would like to have a conversation just to begin rebuilding the bridges that have been torn down. All of my peace friends said it's impossible. You cannot do it now. In fact, many of them got kind of mad at me for even proposing it, because I should have been on the side of putting some energy into hitting old Vladimir where it hurts. And I agree. I don't like it, but it is, I think, really worthwhile to maintain conversations of almost any kind with look for alternative ways of solving our risk situations. Tell me, how about that in Britain? What do you sense there about public attitude on these issues? For example, there's a whole question of the Scots leaving and taking the nuclear submarine base out from under Britain, or whatever it's going to be called Britain afterwards. What's going to happen there, and what do people feel about that? Is there really still a discussion about reducing the British Trident sub fleet?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it feeds into some broader points as well. So there are two big things, or possibly even three big things, that could mean the end of the UK nuclear deterrent very quickly. The leader of the Labour Party, of course, the UK Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, is a former vice chair of C&D. A lot of people within the Labour Party that would support retaining the Trident system, but that, obviously, if he were to win an election, if there were to be an election due to Brexit soon, or the next election in a few years' time, that would clearly have massive implications. And you're right, if the SNP were to win an independence victory for Scotland, that they've made it pretty clear that they do not want the submarines at Faslane, because it's only a dozen or so miles from Glasgow, and a host of other reasons as well. But I think what this comes back to is the other part of this. So one part of this puzzle is dialogue, getting people together, finding things to agree on, even if we don't agree on lots of other stuff at the top level. But the other bit, and it's true in the UK, is we need to go back to educating people about these things. So in the 1980s, the last sort of major worrying time for everybody, public understanding of nuclear issues, security threats, etc., was pretty good. You had millions of people going out on marches in the UK, at Greenham Common, at other places, similar things in other parts of the world. People understood this. It was represented in popular culture as well, not least war games, which came out very similar to that, but in other things as well, The Day After Tomorrow, and a whole host of other sort of apocalyptic nuclear films. One of my worries today is that people and the public don't really have enough understanding of some of these risks, which is not to say that we want to worry everybody all the time so they can't sleep, whatever else, but I think there is a need to educate the public, and probably policymakers to some extent as well, on some of the basics of these challenges, to remind ourselves what nuclear weapons are, what these other security challenges are, and make sure the level of debate we're having with our representatives is of a decent standard. Because I think that's where you get some of this energy that you're talking about, and you rebuild things, is when it comes from the bottom or from the ground and goes upwards. But that's all about public engagement and public education. That's something we need to do, and I think a lot of us are trying to do in the UK, but also I think globally as well.
Certainly in Canada, it's a big effort at our center, for example, where we try to bring on, we say we try to build that next generation of security studies practitioners. How do we inculcate this next generation with that desire to solve some of these problems and engage with these problems and tackle them in a constructive way. And it's interesting. This touches on so many things, whether it's, the lack of civics education in elementary and secondary schooling, students coming out of high school now, and we lament this in the faculty all the time, is that they don't have a basic understanding of history. They don't have an understanding of sort of how we got here, for ill or for good. And there was actually just this morning, I read an interesting, very disturbing poll result from just taken across, that sort of cliche demographic of millennials, saying that over half of millennials, or less than half of millennials, are supportive of the idea of democracy. Again, this lack of understanding of what it is.
I'm one of those people who I've lost a lot of faith in democracy. I have to admit right now, I am really troubled because of all the things I believe in. It's democracy, but I have to say, when you have people in the U.S. of 40 to 45% of the population thinking that Donald Trump is a good president, and all of the other things that examples that we might give about how the majority of voters are doing things that are contrary to their own interests as well as to the interests of the whole world, and making extraordinarily stupid decisions. And I don't know what to do about that. I mean, how can you believe in democracy when people are so dumb? And that's a horrible conclusion to reach. And I sure don't want to end this conversation with that. But it is. You say, here's where we are. We've got to work with what's real. Well, this, to my mind, is where we are. We have a democracy that's not working. Well, Canada's one of the better ones right now, but around the world, we have all these upsurges of populist movements that are right-wing and totally irrational. They're doing things that are destructive to their own interests. And, when that's the reality, I really don't know what to say about that. Andrew, help save me from myself.
That's throwing me a bit of a curveball. I don't know. I just go back to my point with this. I do think we've got to have faith in human. A lot of the problems that we face, and let's just take the problems of nuclear weapons or cyber or whatever else. They are human-made problems, right? They are humans that perpetuate them. So therefore, it's got to be humans that can solve them. If you can dream up things, then you can find ways to regulate it, or you can find ways to minimize it, or even get rid of this stuff. So I don't know. I think you could view this in a longer term thing. There have been periods in the past as well where we've felt that things are very hopeless, but humanity has found a way through. And I hope, and I'm hopeful that we can find a way through with this. That a next generation of people perhaps can change this dynamic.
But the next generation, actually, they seem to know less than you and I do. I was teaching a course on nuclear weapons at U of T for free for the last, I did about 5 years. I had 20 students every year, fourth-year student. The only class at the University of Toronto where you could actually learn a thing or two about nuclear weapons. As far as I know, that was the only course. And the point is, I'm not doing it anymore. They won't let people teach for free anymore. But I did it because it was essential, it seemed to me, for undergraduates to know a thing or two about nuclear weapons. And what I found was that they all were extremely surprised and dismayed at what they found. But over my 20-some years of teaching, not only that program, but the ones that I coordinated at my college, a peace studies program, I taught by then, several thousand people who got degrees in peace studies. And I never had a single student who became a peace activist. And after they learn something about deterrence theory or how many bombs there are in the world, they shake their heads in dismay, but they don't get active. The people who become active, well, tonight I have a meeting and I've invited a new guy who actually approached me. He's a retired man, and that's the best age at which you can get people. When they've just finished their own careers, about age 65, they still know something or other, and they're still engaged, and they actually want to become active. So for another 10, 15 years, you still have some potential of being able to use these people. But recruiting young people, no way. If they're going to do it, they'll do it on their own, but they don't want my help in doing it, and which worries me.
I took my kids to Jamaica a couple years ago, which was wonderful. And one of the experiences that I thought was the best about that entire trip was the bus drive from the airport to the resort, where my kids got to see a different type of life.
Mhm.
To then get these folks
I hope
world.
we survive until they're grown, and
Yeah,
then I'll be happy to hand it over to them. But I think the odds are not favorable.
yeah.
Andrew, what's your final word on how we should save the world?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of what Chris said. It is about education. It's about getting people to understand stuff. And just as one example is I teach a final year undergraduate module on the politics of nuclear weapons, and quite often my students haven't really or don't know very much about these issues. And I have to admit, I was probably the same when I was an undergraduate student as well. This is something that I learned as I came into sort of further education. But they leave that course, I think, whether they become activists or not, I don't know, but with a better understanding of stuff. At least what they see in the news, they get a bit more of, well, this is quite serious, this is why it's serious, etc., etc. And one of the things I use the first week, and I also do this with open days and other talks I do, is Alex Wellerstein's Nuke Map, which I don't know if you guys are familiar
Nuke
with.
map? Oh, yes, I've seen that.
Yeah. Well, Alex has basically spent ages and ages and ages putting all this data into his website, and I'm sure he'll be pleased that I've given it a plug. And you can essentially mimic a nuclear explosion on a particular city. And yeah, it's a bit of fun or whatever else, but there's a real sober point to it because it tells you how many people might die, how much of the city is destroyed, and all of a sudden it makes it a bit more real when you see it on a map. And I think stuff like this visual thing of getting people to understand is really important. And it leads into the final point, and I think one of the things that works so well for getting people sort of energized around this in the 1980s was the media. There were films around this stuff. There was things on TV about this, and that's actually quite a good way of reaching people. And
We're not doing it as much anymore. It's really hard to get on the press. Okay, well, I don't know whether we've saved the world. I don't think so, frankly. But we at least have got the ball rolling, and it's time to quit. So I thank you both, and blessings to you for your work, and carry on. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.